welcome to everyone who's joined us this morning for the second in our series of events around Building Back Better, the Green Recovery series. My name is Diana Fox-Carney, and I'm delighted to be your host along with Toby Heaps for this conversation today, which is around green power and the opportunities within the power sector. So you'll see here that we have, once again, and I know those who were with me last week, we had a lot of people. We have a lot of people again today. This is a big topic, and we will endeavor to bring everyone in and also get to your questions. So at any time during this event, please feel free to type questions in the panel at the bottom. And I just wanted to start today with a quote, which many of you will have come across in the last few weeks. But if you haven't, I thought this really set the scene well for our series. And it's a quote by Milton Friedman. And the quote goes as follows: "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." And I think that very well sums up what we're trying to do here, which is to develop ideas with your help to ensure that we build back better. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass this morning to the Honourable Catherine McKenna, the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Thank you for being with us, Catherine, and welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Diana, and it's great to see you remotely. I'd love to see you in person, so hopefully seeing you this summer. And first of all, thank you to Toby for inviting me, but I also have so many friends. I can't, the way I've set up my screen, because like everyone else, I'm struggling. My kids took my laptop, one of my laptops, so like I'm using my phone, so I can't see everyone who might be on, but hello, because I know it's a lot of friends and a lot of people I've worked with. So I'm thrilled to be part of this. Obviously, this is something I think a lot. I did think about green power, but more broadly, the clean economy in my past role. And so now I'm in a new role. And as I like to say, I now have money. So you can get things done. So I'll just start with maybe a caveat. Like, where are we right now as a government? We're in the full throes of the pandemic, which is going to last a while until we get a vaccine. And so the focus of our government has been on the immediate health and economic crisis. So I know people are very excited, talking about stimulus and everything else. I mean, our focus is really, how do we float an entire economy? How do we make sure we flatten the curve? And that has to be our top priority. But of course, as Minister of Infrastructure, I mean, I'm still moving forward on my agenda. And for those of you who are a bit nerdy, you probably read my mandate letter, which includes green infrastructure, also sustainability and resilience. And so I'm going to give you some comments, and I think they're a little bit personal to me. So this is maybe less in my official role, but in terms of areas where I see there's opportunities. So I think, first of all, Diana, I like this idea, the ideas that are lying around, we should be looking at. And the good news is we have extremely smart people who have lots of good ideas that have been feeding our government good ideas since 2015 and continue to do that. So thank you for that. I think that there's some reflections that we need to make about how things have changed as a result of COVID-19. And I'll just give you some that come to mind. And I'm also Minister of Communities. And I suddenly have a new appreciation of that title because local community has become very important. We've seen challenges with supply chains. We've seen challenges on the agricultural side, but more broadly, we've seen the importance of spaces, of being able to get outside and be able to appreciate nature in a way that you're able to socially distance. I think we've also seen the critical importance of high-speed broadband. There is a climate angle to that, but it's just also, it's an equity issue. It is a productivity issue. So I think there are particular reflections that we need to make, but on what I am doing right now, we have an existing infrastructure program. So of course, looking at our existing infrastructure program and how do we, maybe even accelerate the investments that have been made in the partnerships with provinces and territories. That includes public transit. It includes green infrastructure, which includes reducing emissions broadly. So we can include renewables. It includes also things like retrofits, natural infrastructure. I know there's many folks who really care about natural infrastructure. Obviously, I do too. Then there's the Canada Infrastructure Bank, an existing tool. Many of you would have seen that Michael Sabia is the new chair. I think that's a very positive development. When he was Caisse de dépôt, he certainly understood the clean economy piece. And then, of course, there's the future and areas that I think are really important. So we had spent a lot of time talking about electric buses. That was a campaign commitment, 5,000 electric buses. That's still something that is a commitment, and I think there's some real opportunities there. Resilience is so critical, and I think resilience takes on even broader meaning when you have a pandemic like COVID-19, but certainly there's resilience to the impacts of climate change, so adaptation. I think that we should be thinking about manufacturing. And as I said, supply chains have highlighted how important it is to also be doing manufacturing here. I'm from the Hammer, as many of you know. So manufacturing and clean manufacturing, what are the opportunities to do upgrades? Retrofits, just generally. How do we do retrofits of our buildings, schools, hospitals? I've mentioned broadband already, electrifying everything, clean power, a huge part of my mandate, finally getting interties between provinces, but electrifying everything. Public transit is a huge piece. We've made historic commitments to public transit and moving ahead with provinces like Ontario, Quebec, BC, and beyond. And then the natural infrastructure piece. So obviously I could go on and on, but these are areas that many of you have great ideas. So I would continue to ask you to, to continue doing your deep thinking, to think about this in terms of COVID-19, what has changed? Because I think even people's perceptions or priorities may have changed. And I don't mean away from climate, because I think we've seen some very good polling that says that Canadians are still, I put it out on World Environment Day, which made me very happy. I think it was Abacus said that, 65% of Canadians still support action on climate change, which is, I think, very positive. But maybe the frame is more resilience, just broadly. So many things to talk about. The good news is I did virtual parliament today, but I have not been called to go into real parliament, so I can actually participate for a bit longer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Minister. I really appreciate that broad welcome to this really thinking that we're doing here today. I'm going to pass over now to Toby Heaps, whom you all know from Corporate Nights, to give a bit more of an introduction to what we're doing.
Thanks, Diane. And I just wanted to say I thank you, Minister. I think we all appreciate and recognize how fortunate we are to have you in this position at this defining moment in our country's history. So thank you. I just have two brief points before we get into the presentation of the analysis by Ralph Torrey. The first point is, as the Minister said, this recovery is going to be, the overriding priority of this recovery is going to be people, specifically getting people back to work and laying down the foundations for future prosperity, which we're going to need to dig ourselves out of this debt hole. And that, if we do it right, is going to work out just fine for the climate. And the reason for that is, even though it sounds kind of counterintuitive that putting a climate lens on economic stimulus could be a good thing and not a distraction and not a diluent or constraint, it actually is probably the most effective strategy, most effective X-ray glasses and vision that we could put in place to cut through the fog and identify those opportunities to get the most people back to work in the quickest fashion, as we saw last week with retrofits, and to lay down the foundations for future prosperity, is we're going to be talking about today with respect to the power lines and the power infrastructure. So without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to pass it over to Ralph Torrey. Many of you will know Ralph. Ralph, over the last few decades, has been one of the central analysts, energy environment experts laying down the low carbon scenarios and how that could all come together to make us a more resilient nation. And he's put all of that might and experience into this analysis that he's going to share with us today. So over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Toby. Good morning, everyone. What we've been trying to do in preparing briefings and backgrounds for these weekly panels is develop quantitative sort of proof of concept scenarios of what future sustainable pathways might look like in the various areas that we're exploring, and how they intersect with an agenda for restarting and stimulating the economy in the post-COVID period. So last week it was building retrofits. This week we're looking at the possibilities for essentially a carbon-free renewable electricity system in Canada from coast to coast. And so to support that, I developed this little scenario. And as I said, this is broad brush proof of concept. That's both its strength and its weakness. All you $1 million modelers who might be on the line, don't worry. This is not what you do. This is looking at what a big picture might look like, what it could do, what it might cost. So what we did in this case is we looked at our current system. The good news is that on a national basis, we're most of the way to a emission-free electricity system. The bad news is that it's balkanized. Provinces have very good interties with their US neighbors, not so much with their Canadian next door neighbors. And so that brought the question, and the result of that is that we have a lot of renewable carbon-free electricity that's basically not able to move east-west in Canada and ends up being exported, while some Canadian provinces, in particular Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, fall back on coal-fired and gas-fired power plants, resulting in the power sector continuing to make a fairly big contribution to Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So the question we asked ourselves, what would it take if in the post-recovery we made that final push to make Canada 100% renewable carbon-free electricity system for everyone, for all Canadians, for every provinces? And so we started with the system that we have. We included things like Site C and Muskrat Falls in the scenario that are already either built or fully committed to, and that also brought in some wind and solar, which is underway. And then we built a number of key transmission links between Alberta and BC, between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and the second link from the Maritimes through New Brunswick, and an upgrade and a new connection between Ontario and Quebec, all for the purpose of expanding the markets for the carbon-free electricity that we do have, while at the same time giving an additional option to the provinces that are still burning fossil fuels in their power sector to get access to Canada's surplus of carbon-free electricity. When we did that, there was still a significant gap between where we were trying to get to and where it took us. So we added in additional investments in solar and wind power, particularly in the prairies in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where the challenge of getting completely off fossil fuels in the power sector is most severe. And we found that we have the sufficient wind and solar resources to close that gap. And so as you can see in this infographic, and there's a little bit more detail in the article that's been posted online, we ended up with a scenario that costs about $100 billion, let's say over a 10-year period. The cost is dominated by that wind and solar, but what makes it possible is a relatively small contribution in the big picture of about $8 billion for those transmission links. Those are what will leverage the opportunity for the solar and the wind power to make the contribution that we need if we're going to have a clean and carbon-free electricity system. So that's where we ended up with. Needless to say, it creates a huge number of jobs. It would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from Canada's electric power sector to zero, effectively, by 2030. And finally, just by way of context, Canadians spend over $60 billion every year on electricity. So as expensive as this may seem at first blush, when you stand back and look at it in the context of our ongoing spending on electricity, it doesn't look quite so insurmountable. This is not the only thing that can and should be done. There's lots that needs to be done at the distribution level, and I think someone's going to address that later. But we really focused on this agenda because we were looking for the opportunities where it could and perhaps should overlap with the federal government's post-recovery stimulus agenda. So that's it in a nutshell, Toby.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was a great introduction. I think when you think of Canada from the outside, I mean, there's a lot of envy for the fact that, as you say, we already are 82% renewable energy, and it would be great to get that up a bit further. To talk about the finance flows that might be required for this, I'm now going to bring in Celine back, President of Analytica Advisors. Celine?
Thanks very much, Diana. Thanks Toby and everyone for the opportunity to be with always great today. So we have as Ralph has described, we've put together a scenario for what we could call the Canada Clean Power Transmission System. And the opportunity with that clean power transmission system is to take an approximately $8 billion investment and to convert that through a really robust backbone for 100% carbon-free power into very significant investments over a 10-year period in the order of $92 billion to completely decarbonize Canada's electricity system. There are some important benefits that come with that, and I think it's important for us to raise the fact that health is one of them, especially in this in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Pollution from combustion of coal in power plants in some parts of this country really have a significant negative effect on the health of Canadians. And it's the case that now the most recent research suggests that burning of fossil fuels is actually a greater danger to human health than tobacco smoking. So as context, I think it helps us understand that this is about all of our well-being in addition to the decarbonization of Canada's electricity system. The way the money would flow in this instance is actually similar to that which we described last week with the federal government and its Crown Corporation, in this case, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, making guarantees specifically to address risks associated with the development of interprovincial and intra-provincial transmission lines. Those guarantees would basically would unlock public financing and perhaps also political will to accelerate the construction of those interties and transmission lines, such that we would be able to commission them in 2025 rather than later this decade, around 2028 or 2030. By doing that, the utilities would be in a position to contract and to engage the engineering, procurement, and construction companies to get the work done, and would be in a position to commission those transmission lines within the next 5 years. One way that the federal government could flow its guarantee for these projects is by buying off the carbon credits, or sorry, the cost of carbon for the emissions associated with the first 2 years of the electricity transmitted by those new transmission lines. And that would, we did the numbers, and that would work out to something in the order of 20% of the cost of those transmission lines. We believe that incentive would get people to the table, would provide motivation to get these projects done more quickly, because the incentive would only be available for projects commissioned by 2025. There would be this similar benefits to those we discussed last year, impacts on local manufacturing, supply chains, and procurement. Obviously, significant impacts on jobs and careers, I have to say, because these are initiatives that would be ongoing over a significant period of time, 5 years. And then obviously the pull-through employment that would result from attracting renewable energy investments to Canada because of the extraordinary robust nature of Canada's clean power transmission system. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Celine. Just one question. You talked about the federal government buying the carbon effectively from these projects. What kind of pricing are you using for that carbon in the model?
That's a great question. So we use $50 a ton because that is at the moment the price that has been agreed and legislated by the government of Canada. But should the price change, then obviously that new price would be considered as part of this incentive.
Thank you for that clarification. Before we move on to the panelists, this great group, I want to draw your attention, for those who haven't seen it, to the question and answer panel at the bottom. There are some very specific questions which I see coming up, and I'm going to ask Ralph to type responses to some of the very specific questions about his work. And then we'll get towards the latter half of this, we'll get to some of the broader questions and we'll pose those to the panelists. But at this point, I wanted to bring in Anne-Raphaëlle Audoin, who is the president and CEO of Waterpower Canada, for her views on what's been laid out and how, how her part of the sector can contribute.
Merci Diana, merci à Corporate Nights, merci à Toby et mes co-panélistes, et bien sûr merci à la ministre McKenna pour ses remarques d'introduction. I'm going to switch back to English here, but as was mentioned just now, I'm very happy to be on this panel today. My name is Anne-Raphaëlle Audoin and I represent the hydropower sector. As many of you know, hydropower in Canada provides more than 60% of the overall electricity that is generated in our country. So it is very significant. And as was just said by Minister McKenna and also by you, Diana, and by Ralph, our primary focus has really been as an industry on the response and on making sure that the health and safety of employees for sure was maintained, but also on making sure that we were maintaining that safe and reliable generation, delivery, transmission, distribution of electricity to millions of Canadians around the country. Now, as I dive a little deeper into our conversation today and highlight the short-term opportunities that exist as part of the green recovery, I'd say that it's interesting because maybe a lot of people are surprised that hydropower is part of that discussion on clean stimulus, because people, when they hear hydro, they think about long-term planning, the decade plus planning that goes with, the feasibility studies and the execution of our projects. And it's certainly true of large reservoir or runoff river greenfield hydropower, but there are a number of, I would say, ancillary works and projects that still fall under our industry that are constantly ongoing and that should definitely be part of a very strong green recovery for our country. And as a matter of fact, before the pandemic started, before COVID-19, as an industry, we had started looking specifically at the refurbishment and redevelopment opportunity. So looking at within the 85,000 megawatt of hydropower that we have within Canada, what could be leveraged within that fleet through refurbishment and redevelopment so that we can add megawatts basically at a lower cost and also with minimal environmental impacts and still benefits for First Nations, which is absolutely critical, and what would be the dollar value associated with those opportunities. So I feel that we are, moving ahead with that plan still, but of course adjusting how we're collecting the information so that we can still, of course, respond to the crisis that we're in now. And I'll get into more details. I don't want to take all the time now as we go on with the panel discussion on the hydro projects, but they range from pump storage opportunities in Ontario and Alberta to transmission into ties, and of course the refurbs and redevelopment opportunities. And maybe just to wrap up very quickly, I'll just say that, the reason why we're involved in the discussion as a sector on green recovery is not necessarily because we are seeking financial support. I think it's important to identify that this is going to have to be a very case-by-case specific discussion, a very regional discussion. But what we want to highlight is that this government has been fantastic at leading climate action, and that we want to make sure that whatever clean stimulus the federal comes up with and puts on the table continues with that ambition of tackling climate change, continues with clean fuel standard, with the national price on carbon, and puts in place a regulatory streamlining for clean and renewable projects. And I'll leave you with that, Diana. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And, you know, it's obviously great. I think the minister who we have with us today is responsible for setting a lot of that direction. So thank you again for that, Minister McKenna. And I take your point on making it coherent going forward. Let's hear now from the wind power side. So we've got Robert Hornung, who is the president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association. What's your thinking in this space?
Hey, well, thank you very much, Diana, and appreciate the opportunity to be part of this here today. Well, I mean, wind energy has been the largest source of new electricity generating capacity in Canada over the last decade, and we've still only really scratched the surface of what's possible. So we can make a significant contribution, I think, towards recovery and the transition to a low carbon economy. And one thing that wasn't mentioned earlier is that we can also do that in a way that reduces costs actually for consumers. Wind energy today is the lowest cost source of new electricity generation available in Canada, less than 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And we can grow and expand that for the benefit of all Canadians. In the short term, our opportunities, though, are somewhat limited and focused in Alberta because of its unique market structure, its greenhouse gas intensive grid. There are a number of wind energy projects that are permitted and ready to go and frankly are looking for customers. And the federal government can help to facilitate that through its Greening Government initiative. It's taken some initial steps in that regard. It can help to support other consumers who would like to purchase renewable energy, but are now challenged to do that in the current economic circumstances with COVID-19. So there are ways to help that as well. But fundamentally, the biggest challenge in terms of developing new renewables at this point in Canada is a lack of demand for new electricity. We have surpluses for electricity across the country. And that really points to the importance in terms of stimulus funding to support investments that will enable us to grow renewables going forward in the future, because we all know that renewables are going to play a critical role in meeting a net zero target. And that's why I'm very pleased to hear discussion here around transmission. It's absolutely critical. It's not just transmission interties between provinces, it's transmission within provinces. It's investments in distribution grids to support the development of behind the meter renewables as well. There are also opportunities to look at mechanisms to support the integration of renewables through energy storage, and we're going to hear about that a little later as well. But overall, I would say it's important that the stimulus package includes a good emphasis on electrification. We know that electrification is going to be key to meeting our carbon targets. It's what's going to create the demand that will open the door for investment in renewables in this country. There's a lot of untapped potential. It's not going to be a challenge to get financing to come in and support the renewables sector. We just need a market to serve. And the last point I'd just make is just to highlight that on the behind the meter side, I know last week this project focused on energy efficiency retrofits, a clear part of any stimulus package. But we shouldn't just think of it as energy efficiency. We should also use it as an opportunity to pursue energy self-sufficiency. When you're looking at doing a retrofit in a home and you're working to use as little energy as possible, also use that retrofit as an opportunity to support self-sufficiency through installation of solar PV panels, battery storage within the home. These are all things that will put us on the path towards 2050 and a net zero economy while growing the economy as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, you make an important point there about the sort of foundational nature of these technologies. And as you say, last week we addressed things like the electrification of home heating and air source heat pumps, for example. And later on in the series, we'll be talking about electric vehicles more and all the things that are going to build up demand for renewable energy. And we need to have that there, obviously, to develop in a clean way and meet the targets that have been laid down, the net zero targets. So at this point, I'm just going to bring in the participants and put up our first poll. We have a couple of polls in these events to keep you on your toes. So Melanie, if you'd like to put up the first poll for us today. This is a sort of general question about whether do you believe now is the time to accelerate the clean power sector in Canada? Okay, well, that's going on, and I'll let you know the results. I think we're getting agrees more than disagrees, but that doesn't surprise me. I'd like now to turn to someone who knows a lot about the grids and the transmission lines, and that's that's Bill Stroker, who's the country managing director of ABB Power Grids. And perhaps, Bill, you can talk a little bit about what you see as the opportunities and the constraints in moving towards the type of thing that Ralph and Celine have talked about.
Sure. Thank you, Diana. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. You know, as Robert just said, the challenge that we're facing isn't around generating enough green energy. It's really about transmitting, distributing, and storing that energy and getting it from where it's generated to where it's needed. And, you know, the reality is that no matter how big it is that the green power wave is that we create, if it cannot be connected to the grid in a shorter time, then we are not going to be able to achieve the scope of the transformation that we desire. So what I'm going to talk about here and introduce here is that what we really need to do in adopting this green power wave is we need to reduce the amount of time it takes for the interconnection of renewables, electric transport, and new enterprise and growth industries to the grid. You know, when it comes to the shift toward renewable energy, as Robert said, you know, the technology to support generation is here. It's mature. It is cost competitive, and said the same. And Canada, being the renewables resource-rich country that it is, there are a lot of jobs to be had by taking advantage of the opportunity to build renewables. But the amount of time, frankly, the amount of time that it takes for an interconnection with the power grid can be quite lengthy. Electric vehicle technology is developing quickly, but when it comes to the electrification of municipal and business fleets, such as buses and trams and delivery and service vehicles, adoption could be more rapid. The challenge is putting the needed charging infrastructure in place and establishing connections to the power grid faster than 4 to 5 years, which is an average interconnection speed or an average interconnection time to a distribution grid in this country. Finally, you know, there are several growing business sectors that rely on substantial, reliable supply of electricity to operate. You know, I've had conversations with companies in the data center and agriculture space, greenhouse space, where demand is particularly strong here. And these industries and many others would prefer that this industry comes from renewable sources. But, you know, the common thread that runs through all of these scenarios is the challenge of interconnecting with the grid. Today, establishing a connection to the grid, one that's sufficiently robust to support the power requirements of a large server farm or charging capabilities at a city bus terminal, it can take several years at a minimum. And this is an impediment to the potential green recovery. So to make these projects happen, I think we need to find a way to accelerate the process of establishing new power grid connections. And you know, one creative strategy we might want to explore is the use of build, operate, and transfer arrangements. This could enable private organizations to develop such projects, develop the interconnection project, get the needed infrastructure up and running, and then transfer those assets over to the appropriate utility in the future, according to some predetermined criteria. And this could present an opportunity to address pent-up demand on the part of both private and public entities, speed up the further introduction of renewable energy sources to support decarbonization efforts and associated targets, and help to create new jobs in a shorter time frame that is currently envisioned. Okay, those are my thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Can you just say one thing about transmission loss and how big an issue that is in Canada, in your sector?
You know, I don't have I'll give you a subjective view, Diana, and with some time I can, of course, calculate something. But there are massive transmission losses, and a lot of our utilities, our provincial utilities, are attempting to do something about those losses through the introduction of technologies like HVDC transmission for moving bulk power over long distances, or through the application of technology like static VAR compensators to improve the transmission. It is a problem, it's a big problem, but there are technologies that can help to solve that problem.
Thank you.
Chirp in on that from the point of view of our scenario. We
Thank you, Ralph.
The average losses are between 7 and 9% of end use consumption in Canada, and we took that into account in our scenario.
Thank you, Ralph. One of the questions we've had is around smaller scale distributed power systems. And the person I'm going to bring in next is Matt Jameson, and Matt's CEO of the Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation that's been involved in the energy sector. Matt, perhaps you can tell us a little about what you're doing, what you think's ready to go, and what contribution the Indigenous community can make here.
Great, thanks, Diana, and thank you for having me this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our perspective at Six Nations. If you don't know, Six Nations is the largest by population Indigenous community in Canada, and we take our role as one of the largest seriously. And what we've actually done with respect to the green and renewable energy space is we've jumped at opportunities quickly because it does align with our values and our priorities and our principles as a people. We've done that by deploying over $60 million of our own equity to help invest and create, construct, and develop more than 500 megawatts of renewable energy that's happened here in our region in southwestern Ontario. I think Bill touched on a great point in that I think that right now, certainly in Ontario, the green energy space has taken a little bit of a bad rap because there hasn't been an opportunity to unlock some of the efficiencies and opportunity that exists in the grid today. And before I talk a bit further about that, I will say that the COVID pandemic has created for us obviously a challenging environment to test our resiliency, but it's strengthened our determination. And it's also caused us pause and opportunity to reflect on what we've done, not just in our own community, but what we can do in the region through partnerships to build a new economy. And so I've characterized the pandemic as an unhealthy reset opportunity. And it's no secret that the renewable energy business or industry, it wasn't created in a vacuum. It was created by a reflection that of times in the past, the things that haven't worked for us. And now more than ever, we have an opportunity to reset and recalibrate our views. And I think that what you'll see in Indigenous communities around the country is that we are not just a consultation checkbox. What we've proven at Six Nations is we have the ability to be a participant, to add value, to bring solutions to the table. Look no further than our recent project where we helped electrify the Niagara Reinforcement Transmission Line, which was an asset that sat stranded for over 10 years. We've actually deployed our own equity and our own workforce to electrify that line to bring value and system reliability to the grid where we live. I think that it's through those types of relationships where the federal government, the provincial government can work collaboratively with Indigenous communities to unlock untapped partnership opportunities. And gone are the days, I think, that Indigenous communities are treated through a patchwork of policy across the country. There's different consultation standards in every province in the country, and I think that that's a shame. The federal government can make a significant change by adopting federal practices or best practices that would unlock these grid efficiency opportunities. We have been a partner in change, and we are a solutions provider. We stand ready to participate in those solutions. I know that Annette's coming up next, and Annette's a good friend of mine, and we are working on an exciting project which specifically will tackle some of the inefficiencies that we see in the grid today. So really that's what we're doing. I think we're doing our part. We're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're bringing solutions to the table.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's also very optimistic. Two things here. I'm going to report on the poll. You're all on the edge of your seats. We have 85% people who either agree or strongly agree, and 7% who strongly disagree, who don't feel that this is the right time or do not feel that the federal government should be using stimulus funds in this direction, and 3% who disagree a little bit. So we are strongly weighted towards the agree, but it's not universal. So perhaps as we go on, we'll tease out some of the issues that are giving people cause for concern. You mentioned, Matt, that we're going to pass to Annette, which we will do, but actually I just very quickly like to bring in here Terry Lynn Morrison, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Indigenous Clean Energy, just to see if she has any follow-ons directly from what you said, from her perspective, about what contribution the Indigenous communities can make in this space, and how the federal support can be of value.
Diana, just echoing off of some of the comments that Matt had made, and speaking from the experience and what I've seen working with Indigenous communities across the country, certainly the way to do projects and the way moving forward, the future does have a heavy opportunity for Indigenous communities to engage in the infrastructure that's going to be set up to transition us towards this clean future. I see that, you know, a lot of the topics that are being discussed are at the forefront. We've engaged with people from across, with Indigenous people from across Canada, and energy efficiency and retrofits keeps coming up in terms of how we deal with the energy crisis. How do we better provide healthier homes for communities that are safe, that are secure, that have a lower cost of operating? So doing those retrofits, I like the idea of installing the energy storage and the solar panels into the home, so that they're not only efficient, but they're also independent. We certainly have seen, and we're anticipating coming as we're moving into the summer with the pandemic that's in place, how are people going to keep comfortable in their homes, you know, providing the HRVs and those type of equipments that'll definitely add value and extend the life of the community infrastructures in terms of their housing and their buildings. So very nice to hear from you, Matt, in terms of, you know, how Indigenous communities can be engaged. We actually have a lot of experience. We are the largest owner of clean energy infrastructure in Canada, aside from corporate and utilities, or I'm sorry, I'm losing the word, but we have an opportunity. We want to be engaged. There's ways to do projects in the right way. And that is by working and collaborating with Indigenous communities. There's a huge opportunity. I recently built a 150 megawatt wind farm for 3 Mi'kmaq communities in the Gaspé Coast. And our partner told us that it was the best project that they had because it was done in collaboration with the Indigenous communities, and it gave them the best project that they had. So I think it's something that we should explore more moving forward, and we definitely look forward to continuing this conversation with you all. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks for that. Now on to you, Annette. Many of you will know Annette Verschuren. She's done many things and been a business leader, but she is also now, as CEO of NR Store, she is one of Canada's pioneers of energy storage. And perhaps, Annette, you can explain why energy storage is important in this whole equation, and also what you think the opportunities are.
Look, energy storage is the glue to help make all of what we described above before me work. Very exciting opportunity. I've been working in energy storage. My team and I have been working in energy storage for 8 years, and we started with smaller projects, flywheel installation, case installations, battery installations. Battery seems to be, in terms of cost effectiveness, really ahead of the game at this stage. But I want to compliment and talk about a project that I'm doing with Matt Jameson and Six Nations team. It's a 50-50 partnership. I truly believe that there is big opportunity on the grid to manage, integrate renewables, manage capacity, manage frequency regulations and other services. And what's really cool about energy storage is that it's both a load and a generator. And so the capacity to, you know, take that energy, hold it, put it on the grid at the right time, and do the reverse really, really makes a difference. And I would say that in Ontario, we could easily put 2,000 megawatts of energy storage in that market alone. But I do believe, so Matt and our team have been working for a couple of years on this project, and it's very exciting. It'll be one of the biggest energy storage installations in all of North America. And I do believe that the leadership has got to come with the Indigenous people on the energy front too. I see enormous opportunity across the board. I see opportunity in Alberta and Saskatchewan to do big installations, maybe of compressed air technology, battery technology to support the integration of renewables there. I see opportunity on the East Coast. We've got to get off coal in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, and some of the ideas that have been presented before, also terrific ideas. But also, getting the government to work with us. CIB is an organization that we have been working with in terms of the project. The Oneida project is what we call it in Ontario, and getting the organizations to work with us. We have to be bold. This is a really important and critical time. On the other side of COVID, I know that the immediate issues are really serious, and we're addressing them as a society. But this is also a great opportunity to filter our investments going forward, to recognize not only clean energy, but waste products and all kinds of things associated with the air, the water, food in our society. And so I think that filter system has got to change, and it starts at the grid. But other big opportunities I see, there's 250 Indigenous communities that are on diesel in Canada. We got to get them off diesel. We are working with Arviat, which is in Nunavut community, in partnership 50% again. We believe that the partnership with Indigenous people is key to our future. And we're getting off diesel with that community. And so we have to do this big time. We have to do this in about 250 communities, and we have to be bold, and we have to figure out how to do this for the communities that are off grid this way. The other area that I'm very excited about, we're doing a little project in Toronto. We're installing power walls, the Tesla power walls, because there are problems in and around in terms of electricity stability. People are wanting, I was in the customer service business a lot of part of my life, and I'm driven by that. And customers want this. Customers at residential level, commercial level, customers all across the supply chain want this, from utilities to distribution to residential, and microgrids in the middle, and that is all happening. And so we've got to be gutsy, and we have to move forward and make some bold moves here. And I think there's a lot of great ideas here talking about those opportunities. So thank you, Diane.
Sorry, I'm cutting in a little bit. We're running out of time as usual. I wanted to bring, in direct response to that, very quickly bring in Roger Peters, who's the former president and current board member of the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. Let's just think a little bit about that demand. You say people are very positive about this. What can you say from the grassroots, Roger?
Thank you, Diana. Yes, I mean, we found that like community investment is a really untapped source of capital. I mean, we found that across the world, there's been a huge appetite for people to invest their savings into clean energy projects, particularly those that are secure. For example, in the Ontario FIT program, there are $100 million put into community projects, distributed energy projects. And in Minnesota, there's 630 megawatts of community solar, and it's still increasing. I think it taps into what Robert and Terry Lynn was saying about the need to look at behind the meter and distributed energy itself. There's a lot of opportunities there to bring in those kinds of technologies there at the same time that retrofits are taking place. In terms of what the federal stimulus could do, it could, through the federal procurement process, which is trying to get 100% renewable energy by 2022, earmarking some of that for community financing would be a big step. Also, there's a lot of win opportunity for stimulus funds to be used for direct support for like utility community power partnerships to accelerate the development of smart grids, which would include storage, solar, and when if provincial rules were slackened, were changed for virtual net metering and wheeling of wind from outside the community. So these are all things that would have a big impact. It would drive down installation costs locally, engage Canadians in the recovery, it would build local support, reduce the NIMBY syndrome, and also provide a local multiplier effect. So there's a real interest in trying to invest locally rather than invest in the largest system. So we shouldn't forget that and make sure that any stimulus tries to leverage those large funds from the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to bring in, there's 3 people here who haven't spoken. I'm going to each ask them to give a crisp response to what they've heard so far before we get into a tiny bit of time for these the questions that you've been asking. So first of all, I'm going to go to Lisa DeMarco, who's worked with a number of green power projects. Any reflections on what you've heard so far, Lisa?
3 very quick points, Diana. The first is when we talk about expanding the grid, we have to be clear that the definition of the grid is smart grid and includes non-wires alternatives. So distributed energy resources, energy storage. So we do first our homework about optimizing, addressing electron waste. We have now about 6,000 megawatts of power in Ontario alone, the cheapest, cleanest hydropower that's spilled. And if we can capture that first, let's start addressing waste first and then optimize and enhance further the grid. Secondly, affordability is a very real issue, and more so in a post-pandemic recovery time. So making sure we're utilizing existing financing mechanisms. Roger spoke very directly, Annette spoke very directly to capturing rate regulation mechanisms that we've already got in place to make sure we're putting in place the cheapest, most efficient and effective grid solutions, many of which include distributed energy and cooperative energy programs. And the third is in relation to the importance that our First Nations play, particularly not just in an East-West context, but in a North-South context. Many of them have traditional territories and rights associated with some of the most important electricity export interconnections. So capturing those in a way that's efficient and effective, like we've seen in the Anwatan First Nations and Hydro One energy storage projects that have been approved and rate regulated by the Ontario Energy Board, very important. So those are my 3 quick comments.
Fantastic. Dave Sawyer, you're from you're chief economist at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. I didn't get you last week. This week I am. What's your reflections?
Well, we haven't talked about building vulnerability into the grids. We're talking a lot about production, decarbonized electrification, and then electrifying end uses. And sure, they align with net zero objectives, but also building resiliency into transmission, distribution, and use. Helps with compounding vulnerabilities, right? With COVID-19, what's changed? We're seeing increased vulnerability sort of piling on, and we can see into the future, floods in Fort McMurray right now, we can see an increased sort of risk associated with these compounding vulnerabilities. The second thing I think about is, we've moved away from grant programs, especially for electrification because of free ridership, meaning we're giving out free money, people are gonna do stuff anyway. And we've moved therefore to more of a loan model. And that sort of needs to probably change in the short term because people don't want to take credit on. So we may want to sort of set aside our cost effectiveness thinking about, free ridership, and maybe get some grants going in the short term just to sort of stimulate. And then in the long term, go back to sort of a more stable loan-based system. And finally, big export sector, right? The electricity equipment sector in the country is growing very rapidly. Our exports are actually going crazy at rates, multiples of the sort of goods and service exports. So we have to think about our clean economy objectives. And this electrification sector is quite large. And I think we need to sort of understand that a little better. So that's it.
Thank you. And last but not least, Pierre-Olivier Pinault from HEC in Montreal. You've been in this space for a long time, so you get the last word now on what's going on and what are the opportunities.
Thank you very much. I think we heard a lot of very interesting stuff, but they were mostly addressing hardware, like transmission lines and storage, very important issues, but we've missed in this discussion the software of the industry, the institutions. And sadly, in Canada, we have 20th century institutions. Regulation is outdated, tariff structures are outdated, and we need to, before making huge investments, we should also consider how to upgrade our institutions, to have shared institutions in how we plan for transmission, how we plan for storage across Canada, how we plan for new wind farms across Canada. And if we don't do that shared planning with shared institutions, then we will basically, may have good projects, but they will always be suboptimal. So that is very important to update our institutions. And we have very provincially based institutions. We have to break that model, which is an old model, and to upgrade it to a 21st century model where there's more shared planning. And we need to also, in terms of tariff structures, to reshuffle all that, to make sure people pay for what they get in the future, which is not what they used to get in the past. So there's a lot of work to do on the software side and institutional side of the sector.
Thank you so much. That's a very important reminder. I'm going to launch the final poll, which really talks about the level of ambition that we should have in this space. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to ask Ralph a couple of questions about some of those original numbers, and whether your job numbers take into account potential job losses in fossil fuel, in oil and gas space.
Yeah, I was addressing that question in my typed responses. The fossil fuels that are currently used to make electricity in Canada are coal and gas. So I don't think there would be any impact really on the oil production industry from this particular scenario. As for the coal industry, it's already on the way out. The loss of jobs in the coal production industry is part of our business as usual baseline at this point. It's national policy. It's being pursued vigorously across the land, including in the oil patch province of Alberta. So that brings it back to natural gas. And yes, the natural gas consumption for power production will be phased out in this scenario. And to the extent that the utility sector represents an important market for Canadian natural gas producers, there would be a corresponding impact on employment in that industry. Relatively minor in the big picture, even for the gas industry, I would suggest. And also bearing in mind that there's been a shift in Eastern Canada, as you know, to the new sources of gas from the Appalachian Basin. So if there were job losses in the eastern part of Canada, in the gas industry, some of those would actually not be occurring in Canada.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Listen, we're getting to the end of this. There are a huge number of questions, and I think again we've probably had a little bit too much time up front and not enough time on your questions, but we are taking them into account, and they will feed into the process that is going on. The answer to the poll, the final poll, the level of ambition, we have 74% either agree or strongly disagree that Canada should make it a national goal to be the first G20 country with 100% clean power. I think when one gets into that space, you can really think about the multipliers for jobs in clean tech and people who would be attracted to bring their manufacturing to Canada to take advantage of that. So I think it's a really important area if we can raise that level of ambition. What I've heard today is that this is an extremely complicated sector, really. We all, use the grid daily, but there's lots of different issues involved here, whether it's about the provinces versus the federal jurisdiction in this space, whether it's about communities and their involvement, whether it's about transition loss, the different types of renewables that feed in and how we can kind of upload them to the grid, but also how we think about demand for power and demand in particular for renewable energy, and whether we can get all these pieces working together. And I think there's lots of good thinking that's come out of Ralph's work and otherwise, and I think there's lots of refinement to think how we can make this we can make progress in an integrated way without doubling down on one area without and not thinking, for example, about the institutions, as we were reminded at the last minute by Pierre Olivier, and making sure that we have the right tariff structures, the right approaches, so that when we get the connecting transmission lines up between provinces, the whole thing works in the way we'd hoped it would. So I guess what I'm saying is thank you for being here today, and thank you for your thoughts that you fed in. We will be distributing these papers as we go, and we will be updating them with your thoughts. So please don't hesitate to be in touch. Please join us next week. As you know, this series is going on for 7 weeks, and this is week number 2. Send any thoughts in between. And thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the Minister. And thanks to everyone for being with us today and thinking about this area of great opportunity, but also a great challenge for the country. Thank you.